right, I think we're going to get started with the finale. So, as I mentioned, this is going to roll into our closing because this it feels a little bit awkward. So we didn't mean to be mysterious and vague in like who's giving the presentation for the finale, but it's actually Jeff and I. And so, like, you know, after 9 years, I'm like kind of cheating by like putting myself in a conference lineup, but I kind of feel like I don't belong. So you should just get started with the presentation, Jeff. Welcome, Jeff, everybody. Jeff.
Hi, everybody. I hope you, before we talk about this, I hope you stop by the community table to grab some of those stickers. There's still some stickers out there. The table is representation of all the groups and meetups that happen in Toronto, except for Kotlin Toronto. But everyone else is represented pretty well there, so please stop by, grab some stickers, come to the meetups, and let's talk about Flutter. So, like a lot of people mentioned Flutter today, right? It's this, it's pretty hyped. It's pretty hyped. And I think I first heard about it maybe a couple of years ago, right, with I.O. I think they talked about Fuchsia and Flutter in the same announcement or whatever. And my brain, for whatever reason, kind of just ignored it. Because Google has this habit of releasing products and certain experiments that don't really go anywhere. I mean, obviously, we all use Allo and Duo every day. But most other products, they don't have the same kind of fate. And so I think I just kind of ignored it. And then some time passed, and then, anybody here a big Fragmented fan? You can clap. Don Felker would love it if you clapped. Yeah, so Fragmented's awesome. And I don't know if you've heard this episode, but it is killer. And the GDE that gives this interview is so convincing that I remember listening to it, and even though I'd already written off Flutter in my brain or whatever, this guy like sold me, and I was like, oh my God, I'm in on Flutter now. But then I didn't actually do anything with that. Some more time went by, and then I actually got to try Flutter because the GDG workshop group that Mark and Solomon in the back there, that they run, had a workshop on Flutter. And so I thought, what better way than to force myself to go every week to this thing, hosted by great people, and we got to learn about Flutter. So you've heard the hype. This is off their website. Every website has this, right, where they have a bunch of features. And I feel like my brain also just ignores something like this because we've seen it a million times. But one thing you should just pay attention to here is that they mention fast. A lot of other frameworks, like good old Xamarin right there, they mention native. Look how many times they say native there, right? It's like all native because people have been burned by these other frameworks, like your phone gaps and such in the past. And so they're like, no, this is native. I've never used Xamarin myself. I don't know how exactly it stacks up these days. But one thing I will notice is that if you look on the far right there of that slide, they say that all of that performance can't be achieved without solutions or with solutions that interpret code at runtime. I think that's a dig at React Native, right? So there's React Native. So React Native, they don't say native, but they do say native, sorry, it's called React Native, but they're like, this isn't a web app. This is legit. I'm Pinocchio, I'm a real boy. It's a real app. This is a real thing, everybody. Don't worry about it. I mean, their website is straight up just like React code samples. It's pretty much for web developers, but they're trying. And traditionally, right, there's this thing with PhoneGap and with React Native where there's always a bridge, and we've been burned by these bridges. Yeah. And that is where Flutter is different. So this is Flutter's difference, right? Where instead of there being a bridge, everything is kind of done in the actual platform, and there's no bridge. It doesn't have to transpile or change anything, right? It just compiles directly down. And Flutter renders directly to OpenGL, right, rather than using a bridge. So that's kind of the main difference. So again, let's just go over Flutter. We all know what Flutter is now. It's exciting, and that is why I was excited about this workshop.
Cool. So just to give some context, so these workshops that we put together, we've been running a lot of different events this year, and just to kind of give some context, I mentioned earlier today that today very much for us, like it's an event that I guess a lot of folks are coming to this one time, but it really is the culmination to like a year of things, right? And so today's event will end, but we've got our next thing on the calendar that we're involved with. But this year kind of took a bit of a different spin. I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the things that we've had on the go so far to kind of fit into Jeff's narrative about what he was looking into. So these are some great examples. So like this year, obviously during Google I/O, we always host a pretty large Google I/O extended, but we've also had this like series of they kind of feel a bit unorthodox in terms of workshops. So starting back in March, we had this like, intense one-day hack session for robotics. We had a pretty intense TensorFlow Study Jam, and leading into the Flutter series that we had on the go this year as well. And so what Google started doing recently, they've been releasing these Study Jam packages. So based on various kind of Google technologies, they've been releasing either series of dedicated workshop courses, or in the Flutter case, they actually put together a whole a free Udacity series that we were looking to kind of follow along with. And these Study Jams are kind of like a hybrid of providing materials for people to kind of learn on their own, but also putting together an encouragement for people to kind of come together and help each other out throughout it. So the TensorFlow Study Jam was really cool. It was the first one we kicked off right after Google I/O extended. For me personally, completely selfishly, it was my first opportunity to get my hands dirty with some machine learning stuff. But it was cool because the workshop that was put together was very thorough, and we had some people that were, had already worked with TensorFlow before. Kind of going back to Kyrie's earlier talk, if you had a chance to check that one out, this whole idea of going beyond the tutorial has kind of been one of our mandates this year. It's kind of taking like what's widely available, these intro tutorials, but then seeing how they kind of fit into the real world. And which kind of like leads me to one of the other things that's been an ongoing theme. We're in a funny place right now in the state of online learning in general, because if you can see the date on this, the date is March 20th, 2012. And this was the point in time, if you can recollect 6 years ago, where everybody was really getting excited about this idea of online learning. It was a huge deal that there was universities kind of putting together free learning opportunities for everybody. And I remember being super excited about that as well. But crazily enough, like within 2 years from that, all of a sudden, these kind of scenarios were being, like, things weren't panning out the way everybody expected. The availability of these courses, we're not meeting with like everybody, going and taking them. And actually, if you look into it, there's some pretty dismal completion rates from people signing up for free online courses. And the fact of the matter is, and one thing that's becoming clear as day for us is that learning is hard work. And not only that, but it takes time. It can also be pretty disenchanting if you get excited and go jump in and start like learning a new thing, and then you find yourself in a scenario where you're not making the progress that you wanted to. So just to be clear, the undertone of this is I actually had a very great experience with Flutter, but I do want to talk about some of the frustrations that I encountered. For instance, this I do find to be quite misleading, in that this seems really cool. You do not need previous experience with Dart or mobile programming. Really? Okay. And so one of the things like Jeff being an experienced Android developer, I don't mean to be a fraud up here, even though I've been emceeing this conference for 9 years, but I'm not. I published one app in 2013 that got like banned from the Play Store for some like weird reason. I never even found out why. I liked it. It had 5-star rating, but like only 10 installs, but whatever. So the thing that Jeff and I noticed is that like going through this area here, like my background is in web, my wheelhouse is in JavaScript programming. Don't boo me. But like what Jeff and I understood is that like up here, like we get it, we see eye to eye when it comes to software development, but we develop on different platforms, and so. One of the undertones for this particular workshop is, can we put together something that's going to work for somebody kind of just getting into it? Solomon and I have been working for years now to try to make sure that the workshops that we put together are accessible for people that may not have had an opportunity to learn programming before in the first place. And we wanted to see if like Flutter fits into that and where exactly it fits into it, right? So the angle that I was coming at it from is like new platform, a new way to make software user interfaces. And so I was kind of coming from it at the perspective of how beginner friendly is it, whereas Jeff was kind of coming from the angle, is it viable, a viable alternative for experienced mobile developers, and trying to figure out where it fits into that. So I'm gonna whip through these. For some of you experienced Android developers, it seems like these might have been painful experiences that you've long since forgotten. So I apologize if I dig up some painful artifacts of the past. But coming from my angle, and again, like trying to determine whether it's something that I could vouch for new programmers, there's actually a ton of command line setup which could be a little bit off-putting. I got like straight up Android Studio is a course in and of itself. Kind of coming in, learning Flutter and Android Studio was a really interesting scenario. I never knew that I had to. That's what it actually says. Had to install emulators. That was not a straightforward experience. Once I installed the emulator, I had no idea how to run it. It seemed I was blocking out my Saturday mornings, from Saturday morning from 9 until like noon or 1, I could get in a good 4 hours of focused new learning on stuff. Be careful of that update button because it will take you down to some bad places. I don't even know what that screen means. But I saw it, and I saw that, and I don't know what that meant, and I had fatal errors, and I'm just used to opening up my code editor and doing some JavaScript and having a nice day, but I don't know what was going on here. I tried creating a repo and putting my code from one machine that was working successfully and cloned it on another computer, and all of a sudden the exact same code wasn't working on the other computer. Still don't really know why. I think I sent this to Jeff and Solomon at one point. This would have been a Saturday morning around 11 a.m. I'm just trying to I wake up with optimism, and then this is where I end up going. I don't know what HAXM even means. So surprise for anybody here who's a web developer, you can't scroll the interface by default. It just gives you an error if you have content that overflows, which I found to be strange. Insufficient storage of what? I didn't know, but apparently there was some apps on my emulator, even though my computer had storage. And so running into all these things, these were all new. And so just to be clear, these have nothing to do with Flutter, but I'm just saying, any Flutter thing that you come across that says you don't need to know about mobile dev, I have to say they're lying. That being said, eventually I was able to create an app. I created a really classic game called Don't Touch the Fire. I put it onto the Play Store. You start the game, there's a fire, and if you touch the fire, it says, oh no, you've touched the fire. I haven't released it to the public yet, but eventually maybe.
Today's the day.
It might be. But for me, some of the key things that were important to me is that it's always really important early on that I can understand the pipeline. Again, talking about going beyond the tutorial, I need to see with my eyes how my app is going to get out to the public, and so I had to go through the flow of seeing what it was like to release something onto the Play Store. Also, in the sideline, starting to dig into things like accessibility and trying to get a gauge as to what the accessibility support was for stuff like Flutter. So from me in the web world, a thing cannot go to market that is not ranking high from an accessibility standpoint, so I would expect the same from any other kind of software ecosystem. I wouldn't say that this is explicitly top-notch, but if Flutter's kind of in its infancy, I found it very reassuring that that they have some of the thinking on the go. So beginner tips, accept Android Studio into your life, embrace it to your family, learn the Dart programming language. Anyone that says you do not need to know the programming language that they use to build the software is leading in the wrong direction. I'll flip it back to Jeff.
So, yeah, first of all, I think a lot of those errors were just straight up weird Windows errors. I've never seen half those, and I've seen my share of Android Studio issues, as we all have. So I didn't find Flutter to be actually that bad, and as no offense, Mark, but
I love it.
Okay, so Flutter is just like a repo, right? So you just put your repo somewhere on your file system, and you point you just set up your path, and you're off to the races. So I found that Flutter has some really cool CLI tools that I was very excited to use. The first one there is Flutter Doctor, which just shows you a nice little handy layout of versions and statuses of all these different things that you need to make a Flutter app and run a Flutter app. And then underneath there's the Flutter repo, right? You can, if you want to switch versions, you just check out a different branch or release, and you're good to go. And so with Flutter, as being a native dev, I wasn't judging it from I was judging it from a perspective of somebody just kind of how it would be if you were kind of new getting into mobile development. But I feel with Android Studio anyway, we've been kind of pushed towards this idea where it's it's okay to do GUI style layouts and edit your layouts in this GUI. And anybody who's ever seen this kind of view where it's like, you go to the preview of your XML, and then there's all these weird, like unless you set it up perfectly, your views are half broken, and it's not very helpful. And then, you know, we've got coordinator layout now, which is this like whole other animal. And I've never actually used it because I feel like it was in beta forever, and then it was weirdly glitchy at times. And anybody here using coordinator layout in production? Not too sure. Okay, so like I was kind of right. Not really. I don't know. So this is what like a Flutter. This is what Flutter uses for their UI. It's just a bunch of nested widgets, nested Dart widgets. So if you're not familiar with Dart, you're looking at another code base that kind of looks like a weird combo of Kotlin and JavaScript, I guess. I'm not. It's cool, but yeah. So it's like all these widgets, and you style them in their instantiation, right? So it's kind of weird, and you might think like, well, are all these programmatic layouts like a step back? Like, where's the GUI, right? Like, how could Flutter not have a GUI? But Flutter has this really nice hot reload, and at first I was like, hot reload, all right, like so instant run, right? It's not like instant run. It actually works. It works really well. It works incredibly well, to the point where it's a game changer. Like, your UI isn't just this broken preview. You're using your app, and it's updating instantly on save, and your business logic's being refreshed, and your state's being refreshed, and everything's, your state's being maintained or retained through these, like, hot refreshes. It's incredible. But if you look at this example here, and this is part of their documentation. Their documentation's all kind of like this. You'll notice that there's like business logic in the UI now because it's all through these nested widgets. There's weird like state and business logic in the UI, and you might think like, what's going on? And one thing I will say about Flutter as a dev is, you know, in recent years, as Alice said, we've been pushed for MVP and MVVM, and now there's MVI, and even Google's getting behind it in like a very official capacity. And I think that Flutter still has to figure that out. There's Block, which is this like business logic components architecture that they have that's very promising. If you've used RX, it's in the same vein. It's cool, but they're not. It's not in their official documentation. So when you start seeing when you only see references like this, and you're trying to learn something, you're like, all right, well, what's the best practice? Like, how do I do this when my app's more than just an incremental counter? So I found that I was able to go fast. And so I learned very quickly Dart and Flutter. It only took like really a couple weeks to get an app off the ground. I found that, yeah, the course was flawed. I feel like we're mentioning that later. I don't know. The course wasn't good. Don't do the UDC course. Am I spoiler alerting? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, the course is kind of crappy. You have to like kind of, even as somebody who's pretty experienced in this, like, you got to look up other resources like crazy. It doesn't really lead you in the right direction. You have to really take some time to dig into things on your own, which is cool, as you should do, but you just think in a course that would be more straightforward. But yeah, the velocity is real with Flutter. And remember that first slide that showed speed and speed, and it wasn't all about native, it was like speed. That's where that hot reload thing comes in. That's where like the velocity of learning and implementing things with Flutter is real. I went to DroidCon UK last week, and there was a guy from Groupon who gave this like great talk about how Groupon, they were trying to sell Groupon on adopting Flutter, and the managers were like, yeah, of course, we'll do it. Of course, you know, one code base, that's the best. And then the iOS devs were like, well, we're kind of on the fence, because they have to switch ecosystems entirely they have to switch IDEs, they have to switch everything over to Google, so they were like, but they weren't out, they were just weirdly skeptical of it. But the thing is that Groupon, apparently, all their native devs are switching to Flutter. Like, they're not using it for both platforms, but their native devs are just straight up switching to Flutter for all their new projects, which I found, I mean, that's impressive. That's something to be said there. So my app for this workshop was the conference app that you're hopefully using. It's this white-labeled conference app, and yeah, my motivation was to create something that could be used in an upcoming event for the community, created by the community.
Cool. So while Jeff was tackling that, even though I was already impressed with myself for Don't Touch the Fire. I still had time left with the course, and I felt I had to take it a step further, because the problem with Don't Touch the Fire was because I had no idea what the code was doing, but it worked. So I was at that zone. So I successfully made my app, but I don't know how it was working, which kind of goes into some other kind of trends of online learning that we notice is a bit of a problem. And again, I don't want to be overly critical, but it's kind of like, you know, it feels like this is the state we're in. So we have a lot of well-intentioned but ultimately flawed or incomplete resources for one way or another, right? And this is really tricky because everybody that puts on an online learning tutorial scenario, they're not doing it with any kind of malice. But a lot of times, like, you know, the online, especially for a lot of newer technologies, we get to the point where, like, you know, things are for some reason flawed in some way or another. The other thing where we're at right now is frequent version changes lead to quickly outdated resources. So I came to understand after a while that when Dart switched from Dart 1 to Dart 2 or something like that, I was encountering errors, and I didn't really know why, and it came down to the fact that I hadn't been doing something wrong. It's just that there was a change in the ecosystem, which again, for somebody just kind of getting on board with something can be really challenging. And for newcomers to an ecosystem, sometimes it can be hard to determine what is critical and what is not. So when you go check out a tutorial, there's a tendency for a whole bunch of stuff to be going on like around what it is that you're looking for, and it's really hard to discern, you know, this is the actual piece of code that I need to do something versus something else. And so my response to that was to put together, not to like add more pollution into the mix. This was more self-serving than anything, but potentially it could be something useful to other folks, was put together like a series of like very small, isolated, almost like minimal code samples that I found really useful to getting going with some of the Flutter learning. And for my model, really what I wanted to do, if you've ever tried and messed around with like the default installation of setting up a new Flutter project, there's a default application. It's actually the same one that Jeff was showing, where, you know, just the thing comes up and you tap the button and it tells you how many times you tap the button. But it's just like it's a pile of Dart. And like if you haven't done any stuff in Dart, yeah, you can make sense of bits and pieces, but it's hard to determine what's like needed versus what's not. So breaking it down, this was the smallest Flutter app that I could possibly make. So taking it down to bare bones, for some reason the default font treatment within a Flutter application is red text with a double yellow underline on a black background. I don't know whose design choice that was, but tip my cap to that person. This was the smallest Flutter app that I could possibly make. And I guess so, like where this gets to, for example, and what I ended up putting into the repo is a Flutter project, how to display a piece of content, how to display multiple pieces of content, how to add style and design, how to detect an event, how to work with states, and how to implement the basic material layout, which again are all things that are kind of assumed by that basic project. But you know, really kind of building that foundational understanding was a priority there. So by that point, like there's I think like 11 or 12 projects within that GitHub repo right now. So hopefully those could be of benefit and really kind of help me develop confidence working with Flutter. And towards the end, it was a real pleasure to work with.
Yeah, so when I was creating the app, a lot of my kind of like what I was consciously thinking about was like, how do they do it in Dart versus how do they do it in Java, not even Kotlin. But yeah, so this is just kind of an example of something that's included as Dart that Mark probably didn't even think twice about, where it's like, image.network and the URL and everything's just kind of handled. And these the kind of very typical things you would do in Android development is just included with Dart because it's a new kind of progressive framework. But it's not always, you know, perfect. So there's this thing with Dart where Dart doesn't do reflection because of tree shaking. And so there's no JSON or klaxon or anything like that. So you have to use tools that generate code for you. And those tools there's like a bit of awkwardness there where it's generating code for you and then, you know. But yeah, it's just something to be known. There's like these boilerplate things that you kind of gotta add to even just like serialize JSON. So that's a thing. And another thing that happened with the app that I had never experienced as an Android developer was I had to use the App Store, the Apple App Store. I'd never used the Apple App Store before, and they banned the app. They right away banned the app, and
they rejected it, man. It didn't even make it into.
Yeah, oh yeah, so there's no iOS version, spoiler alert, for this conference. And I'll explain why. So they mention here that the app includes Android references. And my first reaction was like, yeah, the conference is called AndroidTO. How can I not have Android references, right? So I like, oh yeah, so yeah, AndroidTO, okay, there's an Android reference, and oh yeah, the description and there's a keyword. Yeah, but yeah, like maybe we could, is it too late to rename the conference to?
We considered it briefly.
Okay. Next year.
Mobile TO.
So included in this this rejected email or message, whatever, was there was screenshots. And so these are the screenshots that they gave me. I circled it, but apparently Alex can't be a developer, an Android developer. That second page, at first I was like, there's nothing mentions Android on this page. And then I was like, oh yeah, the giant AndroidTO logo at the top of every single page. There's no reference of Android here. And Sam, I don't know where you are and what you did to Apple to make them ban you, but apparently can't have Sam in your app at all. This page was the worst, right? The About page is going to mention Android a couple times at least. And yeah, so there was one more screenshot, and I was like, all right, let's just check this out. And it wasn't even a screenshot. It was just the icon itself was just, So at this point, I was just like, this is insane. I was like, there's got to be a way to submit your app to the Apple App Store. Like, DroidCon New York does it. DroidCon New York and San Francisco have an app that's on the App Store. I was just like, how the hell did they do it? It's been years now. So I went on Slack and I messaged Kevin Galligan, and I was just like, Kevin, like, what did you do? How did you get your app on the App Store? And he was just like, he points me at this Medium article, and he talks about how he literally just replaces the photo of the Andy Android or with a sad puppy. That was the app. Like, that's what you see when you load the app. And he changes the reference of the word Android to just square brackets sad puppy. And they approved it, right? They approved it. That's the app on the store. They use that every year for the conference. And I don't know what the ratings are like or if people are super confused. They have the benefit of not being called Android something. They're DroidCon, so they can get away with it, I guess. So I'm not one to mess with success. I was like, well, let's see if I can maybe implement it. So the first thing I did was change my icon from that Android Andy, like, let's just use a literal sad puppy, just like Kevin, because apparently he got away with it. And then I did some more changes here where I, got to get rid of Android. So let's just replace with the same puppy and sad puppy and the sponsors had Android logos. So sorry, Eric, I had to change. It's just a literal sad puppy again. So I went full sad puppy on this, and they didn't accept it. I already spoiled it. They didn't approve the app, but the app is open source. Please check it out. It's my first Flutter app, and I used MVP. But I think it's worth checking out, and it was really good to make it during the workshop for the conference and have it be part of the community here.
And it's a cool app. Like a round of applause for the.
I hope you liked it.
At least. So, kind of like the reason why, again, going back to what I was talking about at the beginning, just like these types of things, and one of the reasons why we kind of want to close with this talk is because, again, like this kind of started in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, the Flutter thing, like, we started back in August in the lead up to this. Very early on, it had an AndroidTO focus. And I guess, like, the crazy thing about it is that, like, there was so many points of it that were not fun, right? And I guess, like, what Solomon and I've been working on for a while is, like, what kind of format do we put together to help people kind of persevere through, like, the drudgery of trying to learn a new framework, a new language? I don't know the answer for it, but I just want everybody to know and understand that these kind of things are going on in the city on an annual basis. We are pretty committed to doing it.
On a monthly basis.
What's that?
On a monthly basis.
Yeah, it's true. It's
Every
true.
month there's something if you want to come out.
And like to that degree, I guess like sometimes we don't know if there's fully awareness. So, like, obviously we had an awesome turnout today, which we really appreciate. But like literally like one of the Flutter workshops, there was like 5 people that rolled in, and it's cool because it was a cool 5 people. But it's trying to make this stuff more accessible. And again, why we were harping on feedback being so important. And so, what can you do to like keep in the mix with this? So first of all, Tucking one last thing in before DevFest is all said and done, we have an AR workshop coming up at the end of November. So Google has their AR core libraries that they're releasing. So that's coming up as a full-day workshop on the last Saturday of November. So if anybody's interested to check that out, should be a ton of fun. It's run by the same person that ran the hardware hackathon back in March. So Macy does a great job at running these full-day workshops. The Toronto GDG, Toronto Android, just like, you know, always a great lineup of speakers at their events. Strongly recommend checking them out, staying in the mix, and they've been huge supporters of AndroidTO and helping us be aware. And Jeff, over this past year, has started up his social meetup. He was a little bit concerned at how formal the other meetups were, so he felt that there needed to be a social night going on as well.
It's the one with the beer sticker.
And you know, coming back to that, I guess like one last thing that I mentioned to everybody, the folks at Google are putting together for the Android Developer Summit. There's a thing going on in Waterloo tomorrow. So if anybody can make it, it's basically like almost like an I/O extended. It's an Android Dev Summit extended session that they're hosting at a movie theater tomorrow. I think it's I don't know if they're doing the full 2 days, but that's going on tomorrow. So if anybody has details, again, it's really easy to find these things. Like the GDGs are easy to find. GDG Toronto, GDG Waterloo, they're all there. I guess like the one last thing, and a huge like lead up to this event, a lot of you probably saw the messaging going through to it. One of the big mandates for this year has been one key initiative, and hopefully everybody kind of saw as they were registering for the conference. And so as we kick in, and I guess like that's kind of like where Jeff and I are leaving off. If you do have any questions about Flutter and the Flutter experience specifically, feel free to come ask us questions. We'll be hanging out. We'll be going to the after party as well. But I would like to bring to the stage to talk about this. So first of all, we do want to speak for a moment about the Tech for Sick Kids initiative. And so I'd like to welcome to the stage my colleague, business partner from Symbility Intersect, Mr. Paul Crow.
And thank you, everyone. I also want to bring up Leonard. Leonard, do you want to come join me from Sick Kids Toronto? Let's give him a round of applause, too. So I'm sure Mark's talked about it a lot today. 9th year. We are not in the business of putting on conferences. This has been a passion project of Mark, of Macy, of a lot of people on our team. Everyone's got a full-time job, and we put this thing on every year. And about 3 years ago, it just started to kind of make money, even though that was never the goal. You know, our goal was always, how do we make tickets as cheap as possible? Mars has been amazing, giving us access to this space at a greatly discounted cost. A lot of companies have offered to fly their speakers up, pay for their hotel rooms, to help us do this every single year. The first few years, you know, we lost money every year because we just wanted to grow the community. And so we started throwing after parties. We just like, oh, we got some extra money, let's buy some food and beers. And then what we decided this year is maybe we can do something a little more impactful. And one of the things that launched here in Toronto was the Tech for Sick Kids initiative, a goal for the Toronto tech community to raise $25 million to support the revitalization and what's happening at Sick Kids Hospital, which is something that I think was an amazing opportunity. So we set a bit of a stretch goal of, can we raise $10,000? And we wanted to, you know, find a way for this conference. So it's not us, it's everyone in this room, everyone who's been here before and told a friend about it, everyone who went to their boss and said, hey, can I go to this thing? It's everyone in this room that raised the money that we're gonna give to sick kids today. But before we do that, I wanted Leonard to explain a few things and maybe tell everyone here that, you know, the way you get to $25 million isn't a bunch of $1 million checks. Sure, you could, but it's $20 here, it's $100 there. It's, you know, what can you do back at your offices, at your workplace, in your day-to-day life to help accomplish those goals?
Sure. Thank you. So just quick question out there. By show of hands, who here has been a patient at Sick Kids in the past? Okay, and then keep those hands up. And who here knows someone who's had an experience with Sick Kids, whether they're a patient, a family member? So you have a sense from the room how much of a gem Sick Kids is to Toronto. So at Sick Kids, as Paul mentioned, we are committing to raising $25 million just from the tech and innovation community. So we estimate there are about 90,000 people in tech right now, and having everyone involved will help us realize that goal of $25 million. It was actually a year ago in this very room where we launched the initiative. So the many ways to get involved, we partnered with the Upside Foundation of Canada, and for anyone who knows the Upside, they're a charitable organization where founders and CEOs, anyone who has a stake in a company or a startup, can pledge a percentage of their equity to a charity of their choice. And we've actually partnered with them, and one of the companies that have pledged their support to Sick Kids actually successfully exited a few months ago. Another way to get involved as an individual is through monthly givings, whether it's a $20 gift each month. If you are a founder who has exited a company and is sitting on a wad of cash, definitely talk to me after this. But we offer multi-year pledge options for those individuals. And then there are corporations, companies who have employee giving programs or corporate social responsibility platforms, and you ask to leverage those. I was just telling Paul earlier that there was a company who did an internal staff auction where each person offered an experience, whether that's a cottage for a weekend or personal training lessons at a gym, and then people would bid on it from the office, and they managed to raise over $10,000 just over lunchtime, and host an event. So this is a perfect example of how we partner with members of the community in raising funds, just from whether it's a portion of ticket sales or host a barbecue or a lemonade stand. It all goes down to the same cause. And we're happy to say that a year into this initiative, we've managed to raise almost $4 million just from this community alone. So keep that momentum going. Thank you.
Thank you. So another one of my dreams in life is always to be involved in a large check transaction. So we had a large check here presented that Leonard's going to have to take back to the office, maybe on the subway, and walk down the street with it. So thank you, everyone, for supporting us here at AndroidTO, making this possible.